Welcome to Civility and American Democracy on National Forum. Presented by the Center for Civil Discourse at the McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. In partnership with Mass Humanities, WBUR Radio, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Moderating today's discussion, the host of WBUR's On Point, Tom Ashbrook.
Welcome again. It's great to be with you. Now, with a tremendous sense of history at our backs, we plunge forward into this very, very big subject. This session will be civility and morality. It's hard to get much bigger than that. There are big questions here. Is civility a smokescreen to maintain the status quo? Does it encourage conformity and inhibit dissent? Is civility sometimes in conflict with other important moral values, or simply with moral values? This question could a new civility lead to a better informed citizenry? This panel will explore the relationship between civility and morality and the demands of justice, and it is a wonderful panel indeed. Austin Surratt is with us, professor of jurisprudence and political science at Amherst College. Alan Wolfe, professor of political science, Boston College, and David L. Smith, professor of English, Williams College. Austin Surratt will kick us off today. Professor Surratt.
When I received the invitation to participate in this forum, I was brought back immediately to scenes of my childhood. I was brought up in a house of many mottos, many aphorisms, and many slogans. Indeed, every day at breakfast, I remember a little 3x5 card left at breakfast inscribed with what was called then the thought of the day. The more important the thought, the larger the index card. The more important the thought, the more vivid the inscription on the index card. And I think my mother's favorite, it was her largest and most vivid index card: being polite is always right. That was Mom's favorite motto. And I guess I'm here today to carry on an argument with Mom. So powerful was this message that 50 years ago, I stood on a stage like this, it was called a bima, to deliver my bar mitzvah speech. And I found a way to weave into my interpretation of my Torah portion Mom's favorite motto: being polite is always right. Mom sat about where John is now, smiling, kfelling, proud of her little boy. In today's world, it's a little hard, I think, to raise questions about civility. But I think it's particularly important to do so. Much of what I'm going to say in my few minutes is going to be perfectly continuous, indeed repetitive, of what you heard a little while ago. In an era in which incivility is all around us, in our public life, in our private life, I love the idea of the classroom as a haven from incivility. It doesn't describe the classrooms at Amherst. I'm sure it describes those at Williams. In an era in which there's so much incivility around us, in which incivility marks speech, incivility marks action, in which the boundaries of what is civil and uncivil are up for grabs, it's a little hard to raise questions about civility. We have many leading advocates of civility in the United States today. Among the most important, President Barack Obama, who's spoken about it often in his public rhetoric. And indeed, in perhaps the foundation of Obama's political career, his speech at the 2004 Democratic Convention, while he didn't invoke the language of civility directly, the image of one America, not red, not blue, I think was a powerful preface to what would be an important theme of Obama's presidency. From his speech at Notre Dame to the remarkable and moving speech after the shootings in Arizona, Obama has invoked this theme, that civility is central to American democracy. Now, the introduction to this forum took up the challenge of defining civility. And there is a range of definitions of civility, from politeness to respect to engagement with the other to a willingness to compromise. For Obama, civility arises, I think, from modesty, from a sense of humility about one's public commitments. At Notre Dame, he said, civility sparks good works, charity, and kindness that marks hearts and minds. Well, today, in a sense, what I want to do is to carry on a conversation with the president, and more importantly, with my mom, and suggest that at least where central public values are concerned, and I'm sure we'll return to this question of what is a central public value, that where central public values are concerned, civility is not our highest value. It is not always better to be polite than to be right, and breaches of civility do not always threaten democratic dialogue. So to put it directly, I have 2 points to make. One, civility is a secondary, not a primary moral virtue. And second, that we need to be careful to nurture the conditions under which civility can flourish. Calling for civility when conditions of injustice are such to propel anger and dissent and perhaps even violence seems to me to be a misplaced emphasis. It's not that civility has no value. The value of civility is great. Civility in the public realm is a little bit like due process of law in the realm of our legal institutions. To illustrate my worry about civility, I want to offer one example of what I would call a pathology of civility. An example in which the discourse of civility was used not to encourage dissent, but to call dissent to heel. I want to use an example in which the discourse of civility was not used to praise Martin Luther King, but rather to criticize him and to try to domesticate his activities. So let me take you back 50 years beyond my bar mitzvah to Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. Birmingham in 1963 was perhaps America's most segregated city. You'll remember that in 1963, King and others came to Birmingham to protest the rampant segregation in Birmingham. They were met by police dogs, they were met by fire hoses, and they were met with the warm embrace of Bull Connor. They wanted to protest. In their own way, they wanted to protest peacefully on Good Friday and on Easter Sunday. They were denied a parade permit, which is one of the legal requirements of civil protest in the United States. And Bull Connor, following a tactic which was then widely used in the South, it wasn't enough just to deny them a parade permit. He went to court and sought an injunction, a legal order, preventing the protest from happening. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had encountered this strategy elsewhere in the South. And in the past, they had complied with those injunctions. But in Birmingham, they said no, they would not comply. They would disobey the law and march on Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And so they did, and they were arrested, and they were charged with contempt of court. On the Monday following the Easter protests, King and his lawyers went into the trial court and appealed to the judge not to cite them for contempt, to lift the contempt against them. The judge refused to do so. Standing on the proposition that there is nothing more important than respect for the law, the judge sent them off to jail. Eventually, their case made its way to the United States Supreme Court in a case which is not often talked about in American public discourse, read about in law schools, but I think not widely known in forums like this, a case called Walker versus Birmingham, which if you haven't read and you're looking for something to be depressed about, other than the impending baseball season, I recommend to you. Before the case reached the United States Supreme Court, 8 Alabama clergymen, allegedly white moderates, issued a statement condemning the demonstration in terms which would become reminiscent, or they forecast what the United States Supreme Court would say. Listen to these words. We recognize, these ministers said, the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized. But we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. All of us need to face the responsibility of finding, quote, proper channels for the accomplishment of the goals that we seek. Just as we formally pointed out that hatred and violence have no sanction in our religious and political traditions, we also need to point out that the actions taken by the demonstrators in Birmingham are themselves inciting hatred and violence. Listen to the language of the United States Supreme Court. Justice Stewart, writing in Walker versus Birmingham, said, no matter how righteous one's commitment, no matter how just one's cause, respect for the law is a small price to pay for civilization itself. In reading those lines, in thinking about Walker versus Birmingham, I'm reminded of another great thinker of the 1960s, Herbert Marcuse, who wrote an essay on what he called repressive tolerance. He reminded us that tolerance in the face of radical evil is no virtue. This is my Barry Goldwater moment. Tolerance in the face of radical evil is no virtue. So with thanks to the sponsors for giving me an opportunity to revise my bar mitzvah speech, and with an apology to my mother, I want to remind us that being polite is not always right.
Andrew Surratt. With respect to your mother, and thank you, but you say a couple of things. You say incivility is all around us, and you suggest that injustice is all around us. So, but then, is more incivility the answer? Is it possible that civility is the way out of this hole of injustice?
Good. One of the problems in talking about civility is to imagine that civility is a thing like gravity. We all recognize it, we all understand it, we all see what it is, and we all agree to it. And questions which are posed as if civility was unproblematic and recognized to be the same thing by everybody, I think is the wrong way to pose the question. One person's civility is another person's demand for deference. One person's civility is another man's experience of repression. One person's speech about civility is another person's excuse for the maintenance of injustice.
Thank you, Austin Surratt. Thank you very much. Let me introduce from Boston College, Alan Wolf.
Well, unlike Austin, I don't remember a thing I said in my bar mitzvah speech. In fact, I don't even remember giving a speech. I do remember the bar mitzvah. I've saved all that money. Look, when I first got this invitation, and let me just say what a great honor it is to be here. When I was first asked to do this, I said, oh, they want to have a bunch of discussions about civility, and I know Tibaldi, and I know Jim Leach, and I know all these people, and they're all in favor of civility. So I'm going to be something of a wise guy and raise fundamental questions about it. I didn't realize that, while yes, indeed, I'm an academic and therefore a wise guy, that all the other people that were invited would go to far greater extremes than I would in raising questions about it. So in spite of everything I wrote in preparation for this, I'm going to try to use this opportunity to say a few good things about civility, just to be a double wise guy. First of all, I think civility presupposes equality. And since equality is a good and great virtue, so in that sense, is civility. Civility demands that we treat each other as we would treat ourselves. That if we're going to be good to ourselves, we should be good to other people. There's a fundamental idea of respect built into the notion of civility and showing respect. Maybe we don't want to show respect in the face of radical evil, to be sure, but we rarely encounter radical evil. In most of our interactions through most of our day, the people that we deal with are people who we owe respect to them and they owe respect to us. And civility in offering that treats us as equals. Secondly, civility originated out of the idea of civil society, a notion that was formulated by thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment in the 18th century and by political philosophers on the continent, such as Hegel. And the notion of civil society, in the German translation would be bourgeois society, was a society composed of people whose relationships with each other would be different than the relationships that are found in either the world of the marketplace or the world of the state. That in the marketplace we treat each other as instruments to the furtherance of our own self-interest, that in the realm of politics and government we are treated as subjects or citizens of a higher authority. But in this middle realm of civil society, this is the realm of what Tocqueville called the voluntary sector. This is the realm of all of those institutions in which we come together for purposes that we choose for ourselves, to pursue objectives that not only benefit ourselves but benefit each other. And in that sense, it seems to me civility is a very positive thing indeed. And the third thing that I want to say in defense of civility is that among the various moral virtues, civility does not demand of us that we engage in heroic or extraordinary achievements to accomplish it. Compare civility for a moment with another virtue, the virtue of altruism. Civility is not altruism. Altruism demands a certain kind of self-sacrifice. Saints are canonized because of altruistic behavior. No one who engages in civility and civil actions should expect to be canonized. It doesn't require that we put aside things that value to us for the sake of absorption into a deep and abiding cause that requires that amount of sacrifice of what we might hold dear in another world or in another set of social arrangements. So we can achieve civility. We can achieve it, and because we can achieve it, and because it is not demanding on us, it gives us a certain kind of satisfaction that deeper forms of moral commitment do not. Now, having said all of that, I do say or I would think that the panel that preceded us, that talked about civility in American history, constantly came up with this question: is our moment worse now? And so on. And I just wanted to add also a comment about that. I thought it was enormously interesting, Tom and David and others, to begin with a panel on American history, which compares us to what we were like at an earlier time. But I think it's also important to compare us to what other countries are like and how other countries treat these issues, which we didn't do in the first panel. And in that regard, I think that while indeed we have certainly a deep degree of uncivility or incivility in our political discourse, we're nowhere near the point of a complete collapse of a democratic system, the way other democratic systems have been when incivility erupted into civil war in those societies. Like many people who write about politics, I've become increasingly fascinated by the ideas of a German political philosopher of the 1920s and 1930s, a man who flirted with and in fact joined the Nazi Party, a man named Carl Schmitt, who's famous for analyzing the realm of politics as essentially based upon what he calls the friend-enemy distinction, that in politics you must treat your opponent as an enemy you would vanquish, that any expression of respect you may give to your opponent in politics is a sign of weakness, that true political action consists in going to the brink of war. And while I certainly think that there are people in American politics who seek victory at almost any cost, who will lie furiously about their opponents, who will spend unimaginable sums of money on negative advertising, who will say you lied during a presidential speech on a hallowed occasion, come nowhere near that standard. After all, if you look at the awfully negative things that, for example, the Republican candidates say to each other in their innumerable debates, let's keep in mind that these are debates, that they're televised, that everyone's watching them, that this is not the realm that happens when politics completely breaks down. So yes, our politics is, in my view, filled with the flaws that Citizens United has opened the door to. But let's keep in perspective what other societies have experienced and recognize the blessings of civility in our own. Thank you so much.
Alan Wolf, thank you. Let me ask you, Alan, before you sit down. We'll do this thing.
Question. You got to get the.
You got to get the question.
Now this reminds me of the one.
All right. Yes. So I didn't expect you to be the champion of civility here today. I'm glad we've got one. But let me ask you this. Is it possible, the structure has kind of been put forward. This is broad terms that we get to think big and broad today, that civility may be actually the enemy of morality. But is it possible that in some cases, in some sense, civility is the ladder to morality?
Oh, exactly. I think that's an exceptionally good way to point it. It's, I would think of it as a first step toward some of the other values that at least some people have said can come into conflict with morality. So, for example, if justice comes into conflict with civility, if justice can come into conflict with civility, which indeed it can, taking the first step of civility can lead toward justice. It's only a first step. But since we can all make first steps, it's one I think we ought to try to make.
We'll talk more about that path. Alan Wolf, thank you very much for your comments right here. And please join me in welcoming David L. Smith of Williams College. David.
I feel that I would be personally remiss if I did not begin by thanking once again the sponsors for this symposium. It is not a frequent enough kind of occasion to be able to have this sort of conversation, and I want to thank David Tibaldi and Mass Humanities, Jim Leach, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and of course Steve Crosby and UMass Boston. NEH is all too often embattled in Washington, D.C. It has shrunk a lot in recent decades, and the work it does is important, and I hope you would agree and give NEH and other humanities and arts agencies, public humanities and arts agencies, your support. When I received the invitation to participate in this, I had mixed reactions. And a large part of the mix was just a sinking feeling, because civility, in my mind, it was whose notion of civility? Who gets to define what becomes the consensual understanding of what civil behavior is? However, there's more to it than that, and as I said, it was a mixed feeling. I also understand that this cluster of words, civil, civility, civilization, in its older history, comes from a root that means light. And these are concepts that are about people coming together in cooperation for mutual enlightenment. We've lost that sense of them, except in the word civilization. But as a humanist, it's important to me to be interested in that and to try to bring some consciousness of that back. It's not just about decorum, but it's about the concept that truth, enlightenment, improves the character. And the improvement in character and intelligence makes itself manifest in how people behave. We don't talk about that, and perhaps we should. It's also important for humanists to make their voices heard regarding public issues and in times of crisis, and whether we're in crisis or not is something we can talk about. I'm not sure I agree with the consensus in the first panel. We can say that point. But certainly when I began to think about what I might do for this, some of the first examples that came to mind are ones you've heard about already. I thought about Preston Brooks and his assault on Senator Sumter, and the difference in the sense of public virtue, public morality, public behavior that was manifest in the reaction in the North and in the South. This man, who was a big, imposing physical specimen in his prime of life, walked up behind Senator Sumter, who was sitting at his bench, took his walking stick and assaulted him from behind and beat him over the head until he broke his walking stick. Sumter was out of the Senate for a long time before he could return because of his injuries. And Southerners responded by sending scores of walking sticks congratulating him. I heard you broke your walking stick, here's a new one. Now, we have two different concepts of civility at work, but who's to say what's right? And so the negotiation that reconciles difference is hard. And it's hard not in a shallow sense, but because there are fundamentally different interests at stake. To come together, people must agree that cooperating is better than trying to vanquish the other. And it's been hard for us to come to that in America, because we always think we are right and we are entitled to impose through one kind of force, economic power or physical power, our own visions on other people. I thought about Ida B. Wells, who was a courageous journalist in the South, a black woman. In the 1890s, she started her own newspaper in Tennessee, and she took up the question of lynching, a real smart thing for a black newspaper owner and journalist to be doing in the Deep South in the 1890s, which was the most violent, racially violent decade of our history. And she, of course, got into trouble, but there were a lot of things going on. The Southern excuse for lynching people was always it's an assault on the virtue of white women. Oftentimes, it was other things. We saw the same thing in Wilmington, North Carolina. These white race riots often were assaults on black business communities. They were about competition. That was the case in some instances in Memphis, and Ida B. Wells lost one of her close friends, wrote about his lynching in terms of his successful business and the specific individuals in the community who wanted to have his clientele. She also wrote about sexual instances where it was well known in the community that this white woman and this black man were having a relationship. One of these guys got lynched, and she wrote a story that said, everybody knows that this person who was heading up the lynch mob was rebuffed by this woman who was having this affair with this black man. Now, that was an uncivil thing to say in Tennessee, anywhere in the South. Truth is not always welcomed, so whether we can have a discourse of truth is also an issue then and now. And just let me say about Martin Luther King, I'm not going to talk at length about Martin Luther King, but the letter from the Birmingham jail is an amazing document because of the way in which he forces his way into a discourse, a public discourse, that is so white supremacist. And when these eight white ministers challenge him over the question of continuing to protest, of upsetting the community, and so forth, he responds from jail. And he wraps himself in the mantle of St. Augustine and the whole tradition of progressive Christian theology. And so he overturns the sense of authority, which I think he's working as a humanist, rereading history and making the lessons of history available to the public. Not just an activist minister, but a humanist who did his PhD work here in Boston and was very well trained and was here at a great moment in the 1950s when there was so much going on in progressive theology that he represents in that letter. And so I think we should be claiming Martin Luther King as a humanist, among other things, and looking to his example. And we need to be more effective as humanists in entering into the public sphere and engaging with the issues of our day.
May I ask you a question? Thank you very much. If I may, and then we'll all come in here, but if I may go further with the letter from Birmingham jail. There have been tremendous papers written in advance of this conference today, and I should say, by the way, you should check out the website centerforcivildiscourse.com. There's tremendous wealth of material there, including David L. Smith's paper. And you write there that letter written from the jail, and this is important not just to civility, but the question of civil discourse, of starting that conversation. You say that it was a memorable example in the way that he addressed those ministers outside the jail, of how one might use a response to immediate disagreements to lay a basis for subsequent consensus. He was confronting them, but in a manner, as you describe it, that laid out the possibility of consensus and not simply conflict.
Well, that's right. One of the things he does in the letter very concisely is to explain his conception of nonviolent protest. And he says the point is to create a crisis of conscience in the person who is doing wrong, and to put them in a position, a public position, where they have to decide whether they are going to persist in wrongdoing or to change their behavior and act in accordance with the principles they claim to believe in. And so in that sense, the provocation of acting up in public is not just about getting what one wants in terms of changes in laws and in the enforcement of laws and so forth, but it's also directed to the white public in terms of where their sentiments lie. And so it's an aggressive thing, and he explains it very concisely there, and that's why a conception of civil discourse that wants to exclude passion, dissent, and so forth is problematic, because you can't have growth, you can't have real cooperation unless you bring differences forward in an honest way and work them through.
Let us bring it to the whole. Please join me in thanking David L. Smith. Now, again, in this session, we will look forward to taking your questions and comments, whether you are here in the hall or following this conversation around the country. And we will turn to those in just a few minutes here. So prepare or offer them now online or remotely, if you will, and we will come to you. I'd like to dive in on just exactly this point, because I think so far in some of the conversation today, there's the notion that civility, let's put that aside. Let's go to civil discourse, because the discourse part suggests that there's more than one party here, and whenever there's more than one party, there's not necessarily harmony. This is not necessarily a minuet at all. The notion that civility or civil discourse is something pallid or wimpy seems to me quite an unnecessary characterization of it, and this example from the Birmingham jail is a great one. It began with a provocation, which was seen as a great provocation, at least by Bull Connor, but turned by Martin Luther King from that jail into both a provocation and an invitation to a moral conversation. It was a challenging invitation. It challenged them publicly to consider and announce where they stood. But it seems to me that, if we're going to look at this in terms of morality, is there any reason for us to presume that civil discourse is somehow at odds with the pursuit of morality? Could it not be that in some ways, in terms of the modeling that our colleague here raised earlier, could it not be part of the very stuff of morality? Let me come first to you, Austin, if I may.
Again, I want to fight the premise of your question a little bit by reminding us of some of the words that you've come back to over and over again. One of the words that you come back to over and over again is the word consensus. So there is no opposition. There is no necessary opposition between civility or civil discourse and morality. That's not my view. I don't think I know anybody that has that view. The question that we're wrestling with is less a binarism. If you have civility, you don't have morality, than a question of judgment and a question of analysis. So as was noted in the prior panel, we have periodic outbreaks of a crisis of civility.
Or the sense of that crisis, anyway.
A crisis of civility, and it's announced, and then we invest in it. And David had the very good judgment of inviting academics and requiring us to speak in 8 minutes, rather than delivering 8 minutes worth of remarks in 45 minutes. Well, if I'd had my 45 minutes, I would have given you the bibliography on civility. But one thing I want to mention, for those of you that are interested, I want to invite you to read an essay by Benjamin DeMott called Seduced by Civility, which was published in the late 1970s. And much of this argument is recapitulated. And the argument comes down to, and I think Alan kind of finally put it, it's where do you put your emphasis? Do you put your emphasis on the day-to-day interactions around, let's call it, mediating political issues? Or do you put your emphasis on the great political issues which define what I'm going to call paradigm shifts? We can talk all we want to talk about the cases of King and Gandhi, and we should. But I'd invite us to think about all of the negative cases, all of the cases where civil discourse moved not one iota closer to justice. So I think it's wrong to cast this as it's civility versus morality, and more to invite us to think about how do we make the judgments of the balance, how do we recognize when commitments to civility are getting in the way of significant advances.
Well, let me put it in different terms than Alan. I'll come first to you. I hear the pushback, and yet I think a lot of people have the feeling today that some of our capacity to address deeper moral issues in this country is being derailed by incivility, that you can sort of just step out of the conversation through anger, through emotion, through loud charges, rather than actually picking up the deeper issues that we ought to be talking about in this country. That incivility becomes almost a weapon of derailment.
Well, since I've cast myself in this role now of defender of civility, I'll put it this way. You asked about the relationship between civility and morality. This whole panel is devoted to that question. So what kind of morality are we talking about? It seems to me the dominant forms of morality that define our lives today in this country stem either from the Christian emphasis on the Golden Rule or from Adam Smith's notion of sympathy in his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, or from Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, or from contemporary political philosophers like John Rawls. And all of these thinkers essentially imagine morality as the ability to get some perspective of removal from yourself, to put yourself in some way in the position of another person, and to make moral judgments based upon some conception of something outside my immediate needs. In that sense, it seems to me the act of putting yourself in the position of another person presupposes treating that person civilly. That without the conception that other person, who I want to see the world through that person's eyes, I have to treat that person as a human being deserving of the same value that I would give to myself. And in that sense, I would make a very, very strong argument that civility is a precondition for morality.
You look today, let's take up the issue of mass incarceration. If all you do in response to that very vivid and large-scale issue in our country is shout, soft on crime, to anybody who raises the issue, soft on crime, never leave the civil part of this out. The discourse itself seems to me not to exist. How do you engage the discourse without being open to discourse? And how do you have a discourse without some kind of civility, not the frock coat style necessarily?
Civility, at least as I'm using it here, refers to a willingness to engage in the debate, which can mean that you argue. It certainly ought to mean that you argue with your opponent in the debate, that you argue passionately, that you argue vehemently. But the point is, why am I even beginning to engage in a debate with someone who holds a radically different position? If I believe that incarceration is a moral evil, and that person over there believes it's absolutely essential, why would we even talk to each other in the first place unless we thought each other's views were worth engaging? And in that sense, that's the civil precondition. So civility is not a namby-pamby politeness. Civility actually makes possible radical disagreement.
In that sense, when there may not even be mutual respect between parties, David Smith, Martin Luther King, in his letter from the Birmingham jail, he was calling on deep traditions of moral teaching to establish a common ground with those he was addressing, is the lesson I take from your writing on this. And I wonder if he saw himself as much as he may have been seen as incivil, as outside the bounds of what was accepted as the cultural civility of that region in any case at that time, if he saw himself as deliberately kind of pushing a continent of civility toward people who didn't want to engage in a discourse, toward people who did not want the discourse, using a moral latticework to pull them in.
Well, I think that Dr. King felt it to be his moral responsibility to put this challenge forward, to kind of create a basis for the beginning of some movement in a better direction. I'm not sure how optimistic he was about how many takers there would be in the short term. He was, after all, a Southerner and was aware of the violence of racial feeling and of the strength of bigoted consensus. Nevertheless, the question is, do you look at an overwhelming problem and say, well, I just must submit to it, or do you make the best effort you can to begin making steps to ameliorate it? And it seems to me that's what he's doing there. He just come from facing Bull Connor's police dogs, and these 8 preachers praise the police for restraint, which he rebukes them for in this letter, and it comes across very sharply because these are ministers. And for them to think that setting dogs on unarmed people is a judicious way of maintaining order suggests a real lack of compassion, and that comes through very sharply. So he's creating a crisis of conscience for them. Their legitimacy as moral leaders is called into question by his rhetoric. But that's the strategy that he's working with, because he wants them not just to say, yes, you've made a debating point, but he wants them to change.
I want to look in here with a fine kind of consideration, because we're talking about civil discourse. He championed civil disobedience. Civil is still in there. And his civil disobedience I take as a kind of discourse. And I wonder from a moral point of view if it is necessary, or sometimes necessary, there's no universal here maybe, but to keep the civil part in that discourse, even when it's disobedience, to our earlier comment from the floor, if we're to can you pursue morality without some element of that civility in it, the respect for the other?
Well, he's very concerned with that, though when he makes that point, he cites St. Augustine. The question that the 8 ministers raise is, how do you decide to obey some laws and to disobey others? And he says, St. Augustine's view of this was that an unjust law is no law at all. And so he's claiming the authority of one of the founding figures of Christianity to justify his right to look at the law through moral eyes and decide some laws are wrong. If they degrade human character, he says, they are wrong. And it's an interesting way of responding to that, because he's speaking to ministers. And the question is, what is your duty in terms of doing right, to obey the law of God or the law of man?
What is uncivil here? Reconsider, please, ministers. Alan?
I think this idea of duty that David just mentioned is absolutely crucial. I mean, when we talk about civil disobedience, Martin Luther King obviously comes to mind, but so does Henry David Thoreau, who wrote the classic essay on it. And in my view, much of the civil disobedience of the civil rights movement was indeed civil, but the Thoreauian total withdrawal from society and almost disdain for everyone else, so that you just simply leave, is an act of profound uncivil disobedience. I know that this being Massachusetts, there'll be a lot of Thoreau lovers in the audience, but whenever I teach Thoreau, I stress the utter selfishness of his perspective, which seems to me tells us something about what civility is. That civil means that you still are engaged in some kind of interaction with other people, no matter how much you view them as doing wrong, as opposed to just simply saying, this society is so corrupt, this society is so radically evil that I'm just going to withdraw from it completely. That latter kind of withdrawal is more like the heroic style that I put in opposition to civility, which doesn't require that kind of total withdrawal.
Does respect and engagement as well, in fact, maybe necessitates engagement if there's true respect. I see you there.
Well,
Austin.
I really am beginning to feel ruthlessly academic.
Bring it on.
I want to invoke that ruthlessness to ask us to think a little bit about the terms respect. So I can empathize with people who commit radical evil. Empathy is the ability to stand in their shoes and understand them. I think I can do that. I don't sympathize with them. So one distinction you want to make is if civility is about the capacity to empathize, again, I know it's an important virtue, but I think we need to name it. But what really excited my pedantry was your invocation of the word respect. So we can say civility demands respect, or we can say civility demands tolerance. Those are two very different things. There's much in the world that I will tolerate that I don't respect. Tolerance is a willingness to live with things. Respect is a positive embrace of them. And if you say civility is about respect, I think you have to name the thing that is being respected. Whereas if you say civility, and this is what I thought Alan was talking about when he made his remarks, civility is a kind of modest virtue. It doesn't take a lot. Well, if it's a modest virtue, it feels to me more like simple tolerance than it does like respect, which is a fuller virtue and a virtue which really does require us to engage in what am I respecting? Not everything deserves respect. So I think it's really important to name this thing called civility. It can be named a very thin virtue, or you can thicken it up. And then it becomes a little more demanding than the portrait that Alan
Well, help us thicken it then. Bring more of your bibliography to us, Austin. I mean, help us thicken this notion of civility, civil discourse.
Right. Well, I think I did. So a good idea is always worth repeating. So let me repeat it. I'm not opposed to civility. I had a PowerPoint, but I'm a little nervous about technology, so I didn't use it. Had I had it, you would have seen that my first slide would have said putting civility in its place. Not abandoning it, not trashing it, but rather trying to think about the contingencies that are associated with civility. So again, let me pick up on Alan's wisdom. Alan tries to connect civility and equality, and I think that's right. The question is whether civility can get us to equality, or whether equality is a precondition of civility. Rawls, I think, would have thought that equality was a precondition of something called civility. Now, Alan rightly reminds us that Rawls thought that there was a way to get to, or at least help us all understand, as a philosophical matter, the priority of equality. But when it comes to translating that into political action, again, I think we need to think about the contingencies of civility, its proper place, and its limits, and whether we want it to be a modest virtue or really a quite demanding virtue.
I guess we're here today because some dream of it as a demanding virtue. It has its modest place and the modest fruits of that modest deployment, but if we want it as a demanding virtue, if we imagine we would like to engage in civil discourse that pursues moral ends, David, how do we know if we're on a path that's moral and not just civil? How do we weigh civil discourse to say, is this a path that's worthwhile in a deep sense, or is it simply a path that's comfortable because it has decorum?
Well, I really don't know. I must admit, I don't think all that much about morality. I'm more interested in civility and this civil aspect of politics, and a discourse around political issues that is about rights, about the treatment of citizens, about questions of equality, not only in an abstract political sense, but to look at what's happening in our country now. This is one of the places where I have some disagreement with the previous panel. There's a radical shift that's happened in the distribution of wealth. That has implications, especially when one recognizes the way in which large amounts of wealth compounds. And so the wealthy are not just richer by adding on the amount of tax money they didn't pay, but that money gets invested, it compounds. And the rest of the society is dropping further behind. Everybody knows this. Clearly, there are political implications, not just at election time, but in terms of the entire way of life of people. And so to me, to be able to have a conversation about that, to begin to try to act in ways that stand against turning our country into something that's like pre-Enlightenment Europe, is a compelling imperative. And I myself would not want to get there with moral language. I would like to make that a political conversation. That's a personal choice, depending on what one's philosophical orientation is.
So what's the role of civil discourse in making that a political conversation? We've seen an Occupy Wall Street, Occupy you name it, answer to this challenge. And you may call that civil disobedience. You may call that even civil discourse with pup tents and, and a lot of people in the park.
Well, I think there's an immediate response to that, which is that we have the Tea Party movement and we have the Occupy movement. They're both concerned with the misdistribution of wealth. They should be talking to each other, but they cannot do that until they begin to address some of these issues of civil behavior. You've got to be able to avoid insulting the other person long enough to get them to have a conversation. And that's why this becomes so important. That's why I think this whole initiative became forward, because the question was, why is Washington so dysfunctional? And one response was because of the breakdown of civility within the halls of the Congress. I'm not sure that's true, but we have to address that if we want to be able to cooperate.
Alan, my sense is that the reason people are here today and following this around the country is not because they wish to avoid the moral life for themselves or for this nation, but actually because they, in a civic sense, they wish to pursue it, and they see it being not vigorously enough pursued, and so that civil discourse I don't see as a call for strike up the Strauss waltz music, but rather let's get in this and talk as fellow citizens of mutual respect who desire a better nation. They want to do it. If we describe it here today as a kind of lesser path or selling out or not stern enough, I'm not sure we're laying out the path people know how to walk down in a way that fits inside our democratic structure.
I couldn't disagree with you more.
With a smile.
Let me put it this way. First, I do think that even the kind of respect I was calling for is actually quite modest. Well, it's a form of recognition as opposed to an acceptance of another person and their views. And so I think I am arguing for a very modest conception of civility, a non-heroic one. And it's precisely because, as a political scientist, I have seen over and over again a deep strain of what I would call romanticism or perfectionism in the American people, that they detect an evil in Washington, big money, whatever it is, and they say, oh, Mr. Smith goes to Washington. Let's go there, let's reform it. This runs throughout the films of John Ford. It runs throughout all of American culture, this idea that the good, average, ordinary citizen is a person of virtue, and those people in Washington are horrible, and if you just let the ordinary people in, sunshine will reign. And that's a very, very romantic and naive way. I'm saying let's lower our sights. Let's expect less, and then I think we'll get a whole lot more. That if we think we're just going to overturn the way politics has been conducted, which always involves money, which always involves people accusing each other of all kinds of heinous acts, we're just going to get so disillusioned that, as Jill said in the first panel, which I thought was great, that 10 years ago it would have been apathy. Now we're talking about engagement. If that engagement runs the risk of that kind of disillusionment, it'll be apathy again in 10 more years, and you'll be doing.
But I don't understand. How do we expect less and get more?
So
How do you do that?
Let's lower our sights.
Lower our sights. How do you expect less and get more? I would think that a democratic polity would need to raise its expectations along with its voice to get more honesty, to get less corruption, to get more responsiveness, to get more even engagement with moral issues. How do you expect less?
Well, I'll let other people speak, but I just want to say, political scientists begin with the fact that a certain amount of corruption, a certain amount of dishonesty is just built into the nature of politics. And to expect it's not going to happen is exactly to bring the sort of religious sensibility of salvation and moral perfection to a world that where it doesn't belong.
All right.
And shouldn't belong.
All right, we're lowering our standards, our sights by the second here, but we're hoping.
Let's make some, I actually think we've been making some progress, and I think that in 2012, in this election campaign, some of the more angry, uncivil, money-laden voices may lose election. It's not necessarily clear to me that the tremendous amount of money unleashed by the Citizens United decision will be as positive a factor in determining some of these elections. Let's step at a time, Tom. Step at a time.
Step at a time, but on what path and in what tone? I want to open the conversation again at this point to our audience here in the hall and around the country. If you have a question or a comment here in the hall, please come to the microphones. We'll be following on Facebook and Twitter and email around the country as well. There's a Twitter question. Let me bring it to our panel from Laura. And she says, would you view the Occupy movement as a form of civil disobedience? If I may, Laura, let me first say, would you view the Occupy movement as a form of civil discourse before we even get to disobedience? And I'll put that to you, David.
Well, I think the Occupy movement clearly is attempting to open up a more progressive public discourse about the issues of growing inequality and so forth. I think it's engaged in civil disobedience when they break the law. When they're not breaking the law, they're simply behaving in the normal way that the citizens behave who want to address issues in public.
Austin, if it's civil disobedience, and the laws are broken sometimes perhaps in the Occupy movement, is that a welcome part of civil discourse in moral terms?
I think it's wrong to equate the Occupy movement with the Tea Party. I think the Occupy movement is engaged in a broader and a deeper critique than current levels of federal expenditure. And again, this goes to, I think, the point that Alan made and Tom, the point that you made as well. I think one way to judge the Occupy movement is to look not only how has it conducted itself when it was, so to speak, left alone, but to use again the thing that you've been raising with us, what kind of discourse has it enabled us to have? And I think the discourse that it has enabled us to have has moved us, again, with respect to political science, beyond a kind of gentle incrementalism about radical income inequality in the United States. So I would say, let's look at how they behaved when they were left alone. That is to say, before mayors and others said, we're going to clean them out of these parks, on the one hand, and on the other hand, and that was a kind of model of civil discourse. I mean, a model of a kind of community and how it functioned. And on the other hand, let's look at the issues that it's put on the plate and the way in which it has emboldened politicians who might have been a little more incremental, not to name Obama, to now at least begin to think a little bit more like the latter-day Al Gore.
We don't know where the Occupy movement's going to go. There's no saying it's over. We'll see where the path leads. Is there an important boundary between civil discourse and civil disobedience, Alan, or is civil disobedience just an extension of civil discourse?
Well, the Occupy movement is a discourse. I mean, it's all about discourse. It's all about getting into the language of politics, something that the language of politics had been excluding. So I see it as almost entirely discursive. So I don't accepted state.
No distinction. It's a...
Well, this particular movement, I agree with almost everything the other panelists have said. The Occupy movement was a movement that came about because there was no space for the concerns that they were raising coming out of Washington, so they raised it in another way, and it's now part of the language.
Let's take a question from the floor, if I may, sir.
Thank you. I'd like to connect up a couple of dots here that I've heard recently. Professor Wolf talked about discourse and why we would have discourse with people with whom we radically disagree on some issue. And we've also been talking about morality. Now, I have a sneaking suspicion that among the panelists today and among the audience, there are very few Santorum bumper stickers. Yet Senator Santorum, Representative Bachmann, Professor Charles Fried at Harvard would contend that they are the guardians of morality in this society. And the third, there's sort of a strange connection here. They're not here. Charles Krauthammer is not here. Charles Fried is not here. George Will is not here. It seems to me as if all of us are coming from one side of the concern for discourse, and those we want to have discourse with are not in the room with us or not in the front of the panel. And I don't know if that's a reflection or a question, but I'd love a response.
Austin, I'll come to you first.
I'm tempted to say I wish I was Charles Fried, but I'm not. Right, it sort of depends on what your model of conversation is. And there is one model which I resist on my own campus, which is what I call the battle of the worlds model, which is the debate. You have a right-winger and you have a left-winger, and they battle it out. Because I think it produces a certain kind of entertainment, but not often a certain kind of enlightenment. So you've invited me to be Santorum, let me be him. One of the ways in which the discourse of civility is important is it helps us think about the arenas within which we contest political issues. The United States Supreme Court made a decision in 1972 in Roe versus Wade, which precipitated a mass social movement. It is a mass social movement with which I disagree profoundly. And I don't accept all of its tactics. But I'm glad that it was mobilized. I think our politics is enriched when issues which are of profound moral significance, I agree with Jill, at the end of the day, politics is not going to be where they get resolved, are brought into the political debate. So maybe that's Santorum light, because I don't agree with the substance of the movement, but I think it's too tempting to criticize the way in which a conversation is carried out. We don't agree. I mean, would you like more? I'll pick on him a little bit more. I'm not sure, maybe it would have been better off had someone been sitting in Alan's place.
Wow.
Well, with respect to that, let me say that I completely agree with Rick Santorum when he said that the 2012 election is going to be one of the most important elections ever facing the American people, and that in some ways, the outcomes of that election will determine the shape of our future. On that, I completely agree, which is why I hope he gets the nomination of the Republican Party, and I hope he is able to articulate his position so that 80% of all women in the United States will vote against him, so that Barack Obama will be successfully reelected.
So you were right.
I think your point is confirmed. There's a big context for this conversation, and we need to keep in mind the full dimensions of it. I should say to our audience that's watching at webcam locations around the country, please feel free to step to those webcams, and we will bring you right in visually as well if you're there with a question at the tip of your tongue. Here's an email question from Pam. How much of the change in civility in our democracy is a result of the increased influence of money? I fear that the power of the individual vote is disappearing. David, let me bring it to you. If people feel disempowered in the presence of towering cliffs of money that are brought into the political arena, is that a disincentive or discouragement from the kind of civil discourse individual at a time we may need to come to conclusions in this country?
Well, I would start, but I don't claim to be an expert in the history of campaign financing. I think that it's obvious, and many people have said this today, that there's always been a lot of money, legally or illegally, around politics and elections, influencing votes in Congress, influencing the outcomes of political organizing in communities, and so forth. So we have perhaps more transparency now than in the past because of a lot of factors. It's not so obvious to me that the presence of money is a different thing. Now, clearly, the recent Supreme Court decisions make it possible for very large concentrations of money to be brought forward in a very open kind of way. You know, this sort of naked use of corporate power and wealth to influence what might be really peripheral elections, but in terms of vote counting in Congress, that seat is still worth having. And so it seems to me maybe that's a change, and one that should be reversed, I would think. But I'm not sure that more broadly that there's that much difference.
Is there a difference between Bull Connor's dogs and a very large amount of money being brought into a conversation? I mean, they both reflect power of a sort, Austin. If we're asking people to address moral issues through civil discourse, and yet we put power elements in the scene which are of such vastly different scales, what's the impact?
Yeah, again, I think you're naming the right problem. I mean, the right problem is what I call the background conditions for civil discourse. So in the presence of radical difference, again, I think we need to think about civility differently when civility is a demand from your betters for you to behave yourself, than when civility is a demand, if you will, among relative equals for a certain kind of conversation. And I think you're right to keep the focus on what happens to political discourse in conditions of radical inequality. And you're right to say it's easy to see that when it's police dogs and fire hoses than it is with money. But I do want to say I think the problem, money for progressives is an issue which should be left behind because it mobilizes almost no one. It just doesn't win elections. How many of you know Governor Warren Tolman of Massachusetts? Because he isn't one. Warren Tolman, a former Amherst student, when he ran for governor of Massachusetts, ran as a clean elections candidate. So what is the problem? I think the problem isn't just money and radical inequality, and this names exactly what Alan names. The problem is a political strategy, a conscious political strategy to move issues out of the domain of the incremental and into the domain of the monumental. It's not that the Republicans are any less civil than the Democrats as human beings. They've just understood that they can make political gain by removing issues from the domain that Alan names the incremental or the partial and convert them into arguments about ultimate aims. And we want to think about why that's happened, and we want to think about how to respond to it as much as we want to think about the influence of money in politics.
Are you suggesting with that when you reframe challenges in monumental terms, they're no longer accessible to civil discourse?
I'm suggesting that we could say about the Republicans or the Democrats, oh, they're not being civil. But we could also actually try to analyze and think about why are they not behaving civilly. And what I'm saying is they learned that there's a very nice article in this month's Atlantic. This is the lesson Obama is learning. He went to Washington to change Washington. And what he's learned is you can't, Randy Kennedy said it, being civil with a bully is not an effective strategy. So I think what we see is that there's more political gain. This is to say, as if I was some kind of cartoon, we've met the problem and it's us. I mean, the reason why that happens is because it has political appeal. Richard Nixon learned it in 1968 in the Law and Order campaign. And many Republican politicians at the national level have continued to pursue it.
Is the first term then of President Barack Obama, Alan Wolf, evidence that civil discourse doesn't work? Is it he came championing it. He gave it a 2004 connection. Let's not be red, let's not be blue. Is it, exhibit A of the limits of civil discourse in our society when the President of the United States cannot successfully, some would say, champion it and act on it and govern with it?
Can I answer the emailer's question instead about money and politics?
You got to answer both.
I mean, very good.
With respect to the money and politics question, I think money, the kind of money that's poured in is a great danger to our democracy, and it grows out of a fundamental misunderstanding of the civil requirements of democracy as exemplified by the majority in the Citizens United decision. Because everything we've been talking about here, at least maybe everything I've been talking about here, is this notion of respect, but it's respect for other human beings. It's human beings that we share the planet with that have rights like us, that are rights-bearing creatures. The idea that a corporation has a right to free speech is such a fundamentally contradiction to that way of thinking that, so okay, I got some applause. With Barack Obama, he is almost, some of us were actually trying to warn him about that kind of idealism. You didn't have to be a Clinton triangulist to see that Obama was heading for trouble, that there was another path between the kind of pure cynicism of the Dick Morris advice to Bill Clinton about essentially cut the Democrats in Congress off and triangulate with the Republicans, and Obama's idealism about how he's going to bring new. He could have found, I think he did set himself up for a terrible fall. He didn't recognize that he would be much better off fighting rather than essentially conceding from the beginning. But to his credit, he's learned. And he's now where he should have been 3 years ago. But what? That's progress.
Davis,
that's what I mean.
Yeah,
that's increments.
Davis, let me put the same thing to you. What lesson do you draw? I mean, we're all here today to think about civil discourse. In this panel, we're thinking about civil discourse and morality. Barack Obama wrote about both in his early work. He campaigned certainly on civil discourse. He came into the White House promising to implement it, and we've seen some degree of tremendous frustration there. So what lesson do you take from that? Here we are at a forum devoted to civil discourse with a president who, ran the flag up and got it shot to shreds. What lesson do we draw?
Well, I have contradictory observations about it, and I'm not sure that I have a conclusion. On the one hand, yes, it's true that Obama seems to have really believed that he could get people in Washington to behave better and to cooperate and to embrace this idea that everyone who's elected to national office should have a primary commitment to do what's best for the American people and for their constituents. Clearly, that is not the reigning ethos in the Congress, and he failed to get movement on that issue. The Republican Party has been very clear from the moment he was elected that their strategy against him was going to be to blame him for everything, to try to get him to fail and then to advertise his failures, that simply defeating him was their mission. This whole issue of doing good for the people was off the table. On the other hand, though, he's had an amazingly successful record with his the bills he wanted to get passed, with his agenda. If one goes down the checklist of things he said he was going to do, he's done a lot more of them than most presidents, and he doesn't get credit for that. So I don't have a conclusion bringing those two things together, but I would say that there's sort of contradictory things there because he's had a lot more success than we give him credit for.
We've got Barack coming in with a tweet saying, Obama, a leader in civil discourse, his rhetoric is not from humility or modesty, but from rather a pompous elitism.
And he was born in Kenya.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I do think to our earlier audience members, there is a portion of society that does see this call for civil discourse as a kind of elite, tut, settle down there, rowdy people, don't rock the boat, or in a way that we don't like. Whatever you define it.
A lot of Americans have problems with, especially, there's a racial dimension to this. Mm-hmm. A sophisticated black man is aggravating to a lot of Americans. And he's not pretending to be what he's not. He owns blue jeans. You don't see him in blue jeans a lot. He's not trying to dress down, to talk down, to pretend that, he just came in out of the ghetto. And so there's a lot of negativity aimed at him because, you know, he's Harvard and he's all of those kinds of, he has that elite pedigree that people resent. And they especially resent it in people of color, and most especially in black men. So to me, that's where that anger comes from.
Civil discourse and morality. Another question from the hall here, please.
Thank you. My name is Adam Gibbons. I live here in Dorchester, a neighborhood in Boston. I've really appreciated this panel. I came here today a little hesitant because I feel very much as the panel does, that and Professor Wolf said, you know, it's much simpler in lowering expectations in a way, because I think it is about being more specific about the field that you're talking about. I don't think there's a general definition of civility that you can apply here, because then it does become tut-tut, settle down. And you know, we all deal with civility in our everyday life, and I think whatever field you apply it to, it's basically, do the ends justify the means? And I can shout at somebody now and I'm justified, but maybe it ruins my relationship down the road. But we're pretty much here to talk about politics, and I think what's missing, for example, from the comment that came on the field, the response that I think seems to be missing today is what Professor Smith and the other professors brought up today, which is really, I think, best exemplified by Martin Luther King, but many, many folks, which is to analyze what's said and identify the environment or the landscape that is being discussed. So President Obama is elitist, this person says. So address that, define it, and I think what Professor Surratt mentioned, you know, you don't address a bully with civility. But what that, I think you do if you're defining it by the terms or definition of Martin Luther King, who addressed it with great civility, but did not, at the implication when you say you don't be civil to a bully, the civil word sounds like, oh, you just be polite and everything. But I think really there's much broader definition of civility here, which is about humanity and identity and being forceful about your argument. And in some ways, President Obama has, in trying to be civil in many of his engagements, I think has at some points left out the importance of defining the landscape and the arguments and the weakness of certain arguments. I think the thing that was put up on the website is fairly easy to take apart and prove why it's not right. There's kind of a feeling today that someone said something so insulting and ridiculous, that's just uncivil. And that argument, I think, is the weakness of our time, where we're at a place like we were in the 60s, like we were in early 1900s and many eras before, where we're learning how to be more sophisticated, and we're facing a more sophisticated or complex world with media and money and so forth.
Civility is not an exemption from trenchant criticism. We get that, and I thank you for your comment. Let me get one more right here, if I may. Thank you very much, sir. Ma'am.
Thank you. Dorothy Austin, Harvard. What would this conversation sound like if we were talking about the civil rights of gay people? What constitutes civil discourse about these rights, and what constitutes effective acts of civil disobedience?
I don't know that it would be different or why it would be different, but elaborate.
I'm taking this up as another example. What constitutes the civil discourse about gay rights in our country right now?
Who will pick it up? Here's an issue. It's a moral issue.
Yeah.
It's a social issue, cultural issue.
Yeah. Morals.
Well,
Rights.
in the late 1980s, Dorothy, I wrote a book called One Nation After All. I interviewed 200 middle-class Americans around the country about their views on a number of issues. And I found an extraordinary level of tolerance in the United States. It was unexpected. But I also wrote, and I published it as a separate article in the New York Times Magazine, that on the issue of homosexuality, it was like a different, the language of ugly, horrible language that came out of people's mouths was extraordinary. They were going from saying the nicest things you could imagine to the ugliest language possible. In the 12, 20, whatever years since that book, this country has changed dramatically. I said back then it would never happen. I was asked, did I think this virulent opposition to gay people in our midst would go away? And I said, it seemed so deep to me that I doubted it ever would. We're clearly on a path toward acceptance of gay marriage in the country at large, obviously not in certain states. That kind of ugly language, I'm sure, is still said in lots of places, but it's said less and less in public. If this isn't an example of how society can change, then I don't know where you could find one, really.
Relate it to the theme of our day. Did this change come about through active, vigorous civil discourse? Did it come about through public demonstrations of unhappiness with the status quo?
I think it came, because the first step before marriage was civil unions, using the word civil again. And I think it was that when people demonstrated that they simply love each other and they want to be able to live like any other couple that loves each other, you couldn't then continue that language of hatred in the face of that.
Austin?
I think that's I think it's a great question, an invitation for us to think together a little bit more systematically. And I just offer three thoughts. One is that the gay rights movement, it seems to me, is inconceivable without the civil rights movement. So part of the success of the gay rights movement depends upon its ability to rescue the discourse around the movement from the attempts of certain people to say, no, it's not civil rights, it's special rights. That's the first thing to say. The second thing, so I think it's inconceivable, whatever progress, without understanding it through a civil rights rhetoric. The second thing is that because the politics, so much of the politics of the contemporary gay rights movement is about the domestic sphere, it has a somewhat different resonance when even Dick Cheney has the pleasure of realizing the different ways in which people express their love.
In his own family.
Third, again, apologize for offering something to read, but read Justice Scalia's dissenting opinion in Evans versus Romer as an instance of uncivil discourse delivered in a civil form. So in this case, Scalia was talking about the Colorado ordinance, the Colorado referendum that overturned an anti-discrimination ordinance. And he compared the efforts of gays and lesbians to protect their civil rights to what he calls the politics of elites concentrated in cities and universities. So I think that thinking about the gay rights movement, we've heard a lot already today that would lead at least me to go back and start with the civil rights movement.
I want to take one more question from this is again on Twitter, and I'll bring this to you, David Smith. It's from Ruby Martin Keller. And I'd like to put this in terms of how Dr. King might look at this. Are we morally obligated to be civil in our discourse when the opposing view is incompatible with human values? This must have been a question that he wrestled with again and again.
Well, I'm not quite sure what incompatible with human values means. I don't know if Dr. King would have accepted that.
Racial injustice?
The examples, he thought that people were mistaken, but he thought that they could be brought around. Some would take longer than others. But clearly the thrust of his politics was not just to accomplish the specific local legal issues that he was pursuing, but he wanted to transform the attitudes of a society. And so if you believe that people can cross over some line where they hold values that don't belong in the human context anymore, then it would be pointless to have a politics that is predicated on the idea that you can reach people and get them to change.
But surely he was trying to reach across just that kind of chasm in his time.
And some people are really extreme. I mean, I don't think he believed that he was going to touch Bull Connor's heart. I'm not sure if he thought Bull Connor had a heart. But that doesn't mean that the extreme cases, the small number of extreme cases, should be seen as exerting such powerful influence over the whole group. If you work at stressing the things that you hold in common with people, the human values that you hold in common, you can reach a lot of people. That's what his concept was, and it takes longer to get some people to see the point.
Even if you have to step by Bull Connor and reach for the 8 ministers, or even past the 8 ministers to reach for a nation.
And if you have to make a sacrifice. I mean, that was also part of his thinking, that virtue, following God's calling, can be a sacrificial task. And so sometimes in order to have success, you sacrifice yourself.
Civil discourse taken to civil disobedience, taken even unto a sacrificial task. This may sound simple, but it is not. Despite the civil word put on top, and not necessarily easy at all to follow this to moral ends. I'm really grateful to this panel for helping us explore that for a bit today. David L. Smith, Alan Wolf, and Austin Sarat, thank you very much for your time today. That concludes this session. We invite all of our listeners around the country to follow this and much more at the website, centerforcivildiscourse.com. We'll take a short break and be right back with much more.
Civility and American Democracy, a national forum, has been brought to you by UMass Boston in partnership with Mass Humanities, 90.9 WBUR, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the University of Alaska, the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, Claremont Graduate University, the Evans School of Public Policy at the University of Washington, the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs and Civic Engagement at Colby College, the National Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona, the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, the Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service at New York University, and the School of Public Affairs at Arizona State University.